Welcome everybody to our lunchtime session, PD session on deliberative engagement. And we're going to be particularly looking at how that impacts on our 10-year financial plan. My name is Simone Wicks. I'm the Manager of Financial and Corporate Planning at Frankston City Council. So as you just saw, we're recording the session today. So those that can't make it, we'll make that available on our website in due course. Gabby will put it up there. So first, I just want to do a welcome to country. So acknowledge the first people of Australia and the traditional owners of the land that I'm currently coming to you from, which is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and to all the other lands from, I'm guessing, across Victoria, people are coming to us. Today's session is, will cover what deliberative engagement actually is, and we are lucky enough to have a couple of representatives from Kapia Consulting with us today. Several of you would have worked and continue to work through the deliberative engagement process via 10-year financial plan with Kapia. We did at Frankston. We certainly lent on their experience, and we'll cover some of that off today. But it's not an easy space to engage on, and the old days of just publicly exhibiting a plan are gone. And we need to start coming up with better ways to communicate complex financial information to the community and really involve them in the development of those plans. It's key to getting before they're developed, not just an afterthought. So obviously, we've had some significant changes to the Local Government Act and a greater obligation, as I said, in community engagement across all of our strategic plans. So we might kick off just with the presentation from Kapia around what is deliberative engagement and some examples of good financial plan deliberative engagement. And then Nathan, the Manager of Financial Strategy at Bendigo, which you all probably know, gives a wave. And myself, we'll talk about our experiences. I'll talk about Frankston and Nathan will talk about Bendigo. But then we'll open it up to some panel conversation. We'd really love you to pop the questions in the chat. I'm sure you all know how to do that. As you go, just keep popping them in there. We don't need to wait to the end. And then hopefully we get some good discussion. And any burning questions that you have, while we've got some experts here, we can get to discuss later. So I'm going to now hand over to, as I said, the experts. So we have Claire Murrell, who's waving madly at us, and she's the Associate Sector Lead Local Government at Kapia. We also have Neve, Associate Infrastructure Lead, she just waved there, to enlighten us on the basics of deliberative engagement. So over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Simone. And just sharing my screen now, just set that up so you've got that. And as Simone said, so everyone can see that?
Yeah.
Excellent. So as Simone said, I am Claire Murrell. I joined Kapia last year. My background is local government. I spent the last 15 years working in local governments. For the majority of that time, Yarra City Council as the Community Engagement Advisor, but also spent the last couple of years at DELP implementing their community engagement framework. And in that time, actually had some really good conversations with Local Government Victoria about how they were going to be going about their implementation of the Local Government Act with local governments. So privy to a few internal conversations there, which has really been helpful in providing advice and working with local governments. So what Neve and I wanted to share today in our presentation, we're also available to answer questions, of course. And as Simone said, please add them in the chat as you go. We just wanted to obviously introduce ourselves to those who don't know us, speak a little bit about the Local Government Act 2020, the changes that is driving and community engagement for local government, speak about deliberative engagement and what we see as the must-haves. We've got some pretty firm views on what must be considered when undertaking deliberative engagement, which we'll share. And then Neve is going to speak to some examples that we've been working through and some ideas we've got about some opportunities and models and options that can really work around deliberative engagement and involving our communities in that long-term financial planning. So as we go, please do share your thoughts and comments in the chat, and also share where you're from. Introduce yourself, say hello in the chat as well. It'd be really great to see who's in the room, what organisation you're representing, and where you're coming from today. It would be fantastic. So Kapia Consulting Group's been around for quite a while. Since 2007 it was founded. It's owned and run by practicing directors, so experts in the field, Amy Hubbard and Chris Robinson. We're based in Carlton in Victoria, but we do actually work across Australia and New Zealand and in Southeast Asia as well. So we're actually quite far-reaching. There's a pretty good group of us, a pretty big group, over 19 permanent staff, casuals and associates, with lots of broad range of technical backgrounds. So in town planning, urban design, social planning, international development, public relations. And I would say too that stakeholder and community engagement is really a technical background as well. So we're all obviously experts in that field. So when it comes to community engagement and local government, when I spent time at DELP in 2018, 2019, implementing the community engagement framework there, I heard this broadly held assumption, and it's not incorrect, about the close relationship that local government have with their communities. So community engagement should be pretty easy, right? So as most of you would be very familiar now, the Local Government Act has undergone major reforms and is now a principles-based act rather than being overly prescriptive. While that offers a lot more flexibility, it's also led to some confusion in the requirement to interpret what that means for us in our local context. And what this means for community engagement is that legislation now requires local governments to think a lot more deeply about how they'll involve their communities in decision making, particularly in understanding community aspirations and priorities and embedding this into council strategic planning. Now there's a legislative requirement for councils to develop a community engagement policy. So not every local government in Victoria had a community engagement policy or framework in their organisations up until now. And these community engagement policies need to define deliberative engagement as it pertains to your local context. So there's also a requirement that the community engagement that the community must be consulted and involved through deliberative consultative practice and processes when it comes to developing the 4-year council plan and the 10-year financial plan and asset plan. And the sector has really been thinking long and hard about what this means. And my conversations with Local Government Victoria is that this is a real iterative process. So acknowledging that local governments are really at very different stages in terms of capacity and capability, and from officers understanding what deliberative engagement is and how they go about it, from senior leadership understanding the resources that are required to undertake it, and elected representatives understanding their role within this new way of working as well. We're all on a bit of a learning curve. So I just wanted to pause for a moment because we have all been on a bit of a journey. We've all been undertaking deliberative engagement for community visions and council plans. And I just wanted you all to take a moment and share in the chat, given that each of us are experiencing in different ways, for you in your role and for the tasks that you may have ahead of you, what's the one word that comes to mind for you when you think about deliberative engagement? So I just want to watch your responses come through in the chat and have a bit of reflection on that. So Amanda's saying underestimated. Nathan's reflection is citizens' juries. So that's a model of deliberative engagement that's quite common. What other thoughts come to mind around deliberative engagement compared to traditional engagement potentially? That it takes time, that it's inclusive and diverse, difficult to get right, far-reaching, influence. So lots of different things to consider. Please keep contributing to that. Scary for accountants. Nice one, Mark. So here's one I prepared earlier. In October last year, Kapia ran an online webinar on deliberative engagement. We've actually run another one recently as well, and they're available on Kapia's website to watch. But when we asked the sector at that time, this is before going about deliberative engagement for the council plans and community visions and so forth, really similar words. So it takes time, considered, inclusive, empowering, meaningful, resource intensive, and so forth. So a lot of reflection there for people prior to experiencing their deliberative engagement, and a lot of reflection for us now in terms of what we have ahead of us. and what it means for the practice. So for me, what sets deliberative engagement practice apart compared to traditional consultation? And from my experience, I see 5 really key elements. I've got 6 key elements there, but 5 or 6 key elements. So one of those is representation, being inclusive of your diverse municipality. So recruitment's a really important part of deliberative engagement. Random selection's a model that ensures that we're broadening that participation out. So we're not just hearing from those who always self-nominate or we always hear from. And that's really important. Seeing a mini public in the room never fails to interest participants, and a diversity of voices does a lot to create a collective view rather than people sticking to their singular issues. So that inclusive representative group is a really key part. Informed participation and time to deliberate. So in this case, we're really sharing a lot of information that you normally wouldn't, hence why deliberative approaches tend to happen over a number of days with a break in between. So I've seen processes where participants have direct access to experts or decision makers, people who can answer their questions in real time and keep us moving through, and are able to spend time picking their brains and that sort of thing. I've also seen really successful processes using online discussion forums so that participants can discuss, ask questions, and continue to read information between sessions. So informed participation is absolutely critical. Tools and techniques to build capacity. So designing a structured and facilitated way to move people from one position to another. This can look like a can you live with it conversation, or what would it take for you to be able to live with this? It can also look like a trade-off conversation, looking at different options and what your preferences might be. It requires people to hear from and understand diverse and sometimes polarizing views. And it can come across as uncomfortable sometimes, but can also be transformative when we see people shift from a very stubborn embedded point through to really thinking on behalf of the broader community and coming up with a collective view. Now, the power shift is something that we've really seen requires a lot of work with leadership and our council elected representatives. So deliberative engagement really implies you're moving up the higher influence end of the IP2 spectrum. And if you're not familiar with the IP2 spectrum, you can Google it, it's widely available. But being clear what's negotiable and what you are asking of the community is absolutely critical. So there needs to be an organisational commitment that you won't just seek feedback or consider feedback, but you'll implement what's decided by the group at the highest extent possible. Now, this can be really challenging for organisations, especially local government that's set up with traditional power structures with leadership team and elected representatives. So it's something that really needs a lot of consideration to work through. So as I've said, the clear remit and being sure what's negotiable, but also integrity of the process. So trust and confidence from participants, as well as from the organisation, your leadership team, and from your councillors. It's really critical, especially as deliberative engagement is quite resource intensive. So what's the return on investment? Was it worth that amount of resources being put to it? There are a number of things you can do to ensure integrity of the process, including using an independent facilitator, a third-party recruiter, so that's independent of council, and being transparent with the broader community, sharing the story and the journey, the why and the how. We also undertake benchmarking at CAPIA, and we survey each project we work with, so we've got evidence to tell us if trust and confidence has improved, and Neve will touch on this when she talks about some specific examples in a moment. So our experience working with a really broad range of local government clients over the past year, we worked closely with the project teams at the very beginning to determine the model that was best fit for purpose. We found many different approaches to deliberative engagement to inform council strategic plans and the factors that may impact on these, including, short or larger amount of time, budget that's big or small, internal capacity that people have the knowledge and have set the processes up correctly in the first place, and really gaining that leadership buy-in. So these are some of the factors that we see, really important for success. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Neve now, who's going to speak a bit more specifically when it comes to developing a long-term financial plan and how deliberative engagement can contribute.
Great, thanks Claire. So I've been at CAPIA for almost 7 years, so coming up to long service leave. Don't think I'll be able to go anywhere on that for the foreseeable future. But predominantly I work with state government and local governments, and I've worked on a range of different types of deliberative processes. And I started out my career in DELP. So Claire, I'll get you to move across the next slide for me. I just wanted to share I'm really going to speak to this slide for most of my time, because there's kind of 3 types of engagement that we're seeing around long-term financial planning. And what I want to highlight as I talk to you about each of these approaches is, you can see on the bottom there's kind of 2 arrows, and one is about building the participant capacity, so the knowledge and the skills and the level of information that we're giving to our community members. And that's really about how much are we sharing your pain in terms of building their understanding about the decisions and the trade-offs that you have to make in terms of long-term financial planning. And then the second part to that is, which Claire's kind of highlighted, is the level of council resourcing and buy into the process. So I guess the more we hand over or open up the conversation, the more that we need to get the authorising environment or the leadership in the organisation on board with this process. So there's kind of, what we've seen is there's kind of 3 different ways that councils are having this conversation. And I'll start on the left-hand side. So this is kind of a lighter touch and a lighter investment in time, resourcing, and I suppose you could say risk as well. So, and that starts with principal development. So we've seen this through a number of projects where it was built into the broader deliberative process in terms of developing the council vision and plan. And that's really where the group, they've had their understanding built about all of the different things that council delivers, and also things where council might be a partner or an advocate in that service or project. And what we've taken participants through is a process to develop a series of principles. And then these principles are embedded within your decision-making framework. So these principles, they can be around considering community benefit, I guess, long-term outcomes, but also things around, I think another one that's come up quite frequently is about how much council's investing, I guess, in its internal services. But really, in terms of developing principles, they're quite high level. And as a way for council to use these, I think it's quite easy for council to demonstrate how they might have responded to embedding these principles in their decision making. And that typically involves around a half-day conversation with community members. The second one is scenario testing. So what we've seen in some councils is they're opening up the conversation about a rate increase or no increase. So this really presents an interesting scenario for people to kind of understand or prioritise where do they put their money, or how should council be putting their money. So we did this with Yarra Rangers, and the scenario was should council, if council was to have a rate increase, I think it was, might have been, I'm going to botch this number, Claire, but I think it was 1.15%. How would you spend your 10 tokens? And then each of council services were put out on the table, and the community panel were able to allocate how they would spend. And one of the things that kind of came up in that conversation was, well, I'm not sure council should be delivering this, or what is council's role? Why is council involved in this service? So through that conversation, we're also building capacity around the role of local government. So we had the first scenario is we've got a rate increase, so that enables us to spend a little bit more or stretch our budget. Then the second scenario was no rate increase. So how do we make best with what we have? And to kind of create that simulation, we gave, I think, only 5 tokens in that instance. So then people were really having to have the would you rather or the trade-off conversation as they were walking around the table, weighing up in their mind, should I put it in this service or should I not put it in this one? And we found one of the highlights in that conversation was things around sport and recreation facilities, which was quite a surprise. And what community members were saying was, well, maybe council shouldn't be playing in this area. Maybe council could, you know, work with state government to seek grants, or work with the private sector or sporting club. So it was quite interesting just to hear the conversation that came up just as people were deliberating and debating and deciding where to put their money, essentially. So for that process, we would say you need to allow around 2 days, because there's a bit of time that's to be spent in terms of building capacity and understanding how you budget, and looking at what happens now, where do you allocate the current percentage of things, what happens when you can have more budget or no, or a lower amount of budget. So that one, in terms of increasing participant capacity, we've probably done a better job in terms of building the understanding of our participants about exactly what council's doing, but also really sharing a bit of your pain in terms of the hard decisions and the tough and critical decisions you have to make. That one again would require an increased level of council resourcing. So we would need people from different parts of council to be there to help build understanding about all those different services or council divisions. And to explain what's council's role. So it could be in urban development or economic development. These are the types of things that council does to help facilitate that. Again, that would require a higher level of buy-in from your authorising environment into that process. So CAPIA is pretty tried and tested in terms of the first two. The third one, I'll be really honest with you, we haven't done this. So we're starting with our learnings from one of our key friends and colleagues, Desley Renton, who really pioneered this process with the City of Melbourne, I would say almost 6 years ago in their long-term financial planning. And how that came about was the CFO came to her and said, we've got a bit of a problem, like we've got this aspirations from the community that council needs to deliver all these things. However, our budget will only enable us to deliver this amount of services over the next 10 years. How are we going to prioritise? So what they did over 5 weekends, so that was Saturdays and Sundays, was took community through a really detailed process using participatory budgeting. And to everyone's surprise, the community's recommendation was that council should seek a rate increase. And this was prior to the rate capping environment. But again, participant built capacity building on that process was extremely high. They were, I guess, really feeling the pain of finance ministers and CFOs out of council, but also the council level of buy into that process and taking forward that recommendation was high. And that took a lot of effort prior to this process starting. Claire, was there anything you wanted to add about those examples?
No, I think that's right, Neve. I think the participatory budgeting, people will be familiar with some of the online tools as well, so budget allocator and things like that. What needs to wrap around those sorts of tools, though, is that capacity building and knowledge and information building of the community. So that's just something to consider if that's a familiar term to you.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, they're kind of we're saying there's kind of 3 tried and tested approaches, but with each of those, the level of investment in terms of council resourcing and the knowledge that you need to give participants goes higher as you go along the scale. I'll just go to the next one, Claire. So we wanted to just show you how do we measure that capacity building. And this is a really powerful tool. So what happens at the start of any deliberative process, and I'm sharing the City of Ballarat's most recent community panel process, is we asked them about their levels of knowledge around the topic. So for this one was around the council plan. So they understand the purpose of the council plan. They understand the role of council in planning for the future of the City of Ballarat. Do they understand kind of the broader context or opportunities and issues that might be facing Ballarat? Did they understand how council makes decisions? You can see there, two a bit lower on the end of the scale there. Did they believe that council is planning for the long-term future of the City of Ballarat? And then the next question's around the faith in the process. So I believe that council will consider my opinions before making decisions that might affect me. And then it comes down to that person's level of confidence. So do they know how to engage in decision-making processes, and do they feel that they have the right level of knowledge? So the blue dots are the first survey. So we did this survey prior to giving any of our participants any information about the project. So we tried to do it in a really unbiased way. And then the orange dots was a exit survey after the final session. And I think what's really important is that we can see a shift in each one of those dots, and really critically as well, I think for me, the one that's really important is the level of knowledge around how council makes decisions, and also the confidence that council will consider my opinions before making decisions. So that's just another way as well we can test how successful the process has been in terms of building a participant's knowledge around what council does and how it makes decisions. So I think that might be it for our slides, but I just saw a question from Vaughan. So how do you go about selecting community participants for the workshop? So we would recommend that you would use a market recruiter to get you a representative sample of the community. So City of Frankston also did that in-house, I think, as well. I think other councils of Bendigo did the youth panel in-house. So what it really means is you look at the census data and you want to get a sample of somewhere between 43 to say around 100 people. So there's different levels of confidence based on the size of the group. And then you replicate the demographics of your LGA based on that. So that gives you a mini kind of representation of your municipality. Okay, a question from Amanda. So any other examples of financial dilemmas that have been used? So it's the two really is one is around the rates, like rate rise, no rate rise. And then the second one is knowing community expectation and budget. I would say they're the two that I'm most familiar with. Claire?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you know, one that we grappled with at Yarra City Council was not looking at services in isolation, but trying to look at the whole picture. I think that's really important for financial planning. And Simone and Nathan might have, you know, more specific response to this question. But it really it can be as broad or as specific as the need that you have. So are you looking for a mandate to make a decision? And that might be you're in around a specific dilemma that you have, or is it a broader kind of mandate around, you know, how should we prioritize which service, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's the relative prioritization is the tricky bit to sort of elicit or get out, Amanda. But the examples are, don't just do one service at a time because everybody wants more footpaths. It's how you get a group or a bundle and then talk about what's underneath those. For us, it was a little bit of democracy against all of the priorities, and it wasn't great, but I'll talk about that in a minute, but it wasn't perfect, I should say, but it did as much as it got something, and it started some of those conversations and let us pick up a little bit of some themes, if you like, about some relative priorities. But yeah, there's probably enough for now.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nathan. Claire and Neve, we might just sort of jump to Frankston experience and then Bendigo's experience, and then keep the questions coming, keep them going in the chat. So I might just kick off. I'm high level going to go through what Frankston's experience was, and it's more of a lessons learned than than what to do. But yeah, I can best describe that we muddled our way through deliberative engagement. I think we've landed in quite a good position. But it was a lot of, you know, backwards and forwards of whether we should do that, what we should do. And the best way I can describe it is it's our starting point, and we have a plan for how we're going to improve on that community engagement. So I think we need to be a bit kind to ourselves as well, that this is a totally new space, and we're, you know, trying to explain often very complex things to the community. And yeah, we just have to keep chipping away at it. So our deliberative engagement on the 10-year financial plan development heavily lent on our vision and council plan work. And as Neve and Claire spoke to before, we put together an independent community panel of 46 members. It was facilitated by an independent consultant. So we had that sort of separation between officer influence. The panel developed the 2040 Frankston vision and then developed a whole series of priorities out of that using data, evidence-based. They spent a long time reviewing what services council's involved in. That shaped our 21-25 council plan prior outcomes. So we heavily used that information to feed into our service planning and our asset management. So that was the key to our deliberative engagement. However, we did reconvene the panel to do a finance specific conversation. And yeah, I think as one of the commenters alluded to before, we were terrified as accountants to actually speak to the group about how do I explain this budget? You know, how do I explain the concepts of a financial plan? So we had one session and it was 2.5 hours. We were hoping to do it in person, but we ended up doing it online. And, it, you know, help from Kapia facilitating it really, I can't strongly suggest that you get, if you have to do it online, that you have the facilitation done by someone else, because you can't be doing everything at once. So I did a really high level, tried to explain in like 20 minutes what our finances were. And we focused on 3 activities that the group did. One was very much around the services that Claire spoke to before, like what services does the community panel value and rank them. So it was a really interesting conversation and a lot of good information came out of that in strengthening what our other engagement had told us about the key services or the core services that Frankston needed to deliver. We then moved into a really interesting activity on what role should council play in delivering those services. Our lesson learned here is we needed to spend more time explaining what that meant. We sort of came, I think they got a bit confused about what we were talking about with outsourcing, partnering. Advocacy is a really big thing for us at the moment, so we talked about that. But it was interesting to see what they thought our core services should be and what perhaps we should look at partnering with other people on. And that definitely gives you some information to work on when you're doing that trade-off and seeking alternative ways to fund some of the services. And the final activity that we did was how would they like to be engaged on this information? And another lesson learned here was that they thought that we should have like a specialist community panel that was of financial like a knowledge in finance or business, that there was a terms of reference and a capability in that group to be able to understand the complexity of the financial plan. You know, we all thought that was a great idea and we took it to EMT and to councillors, and our lesson learned here is that it wasn't so greatly received, and it is an education piece for us about the role of a community panel. And I think both Neve and Claire mentioned that as well, educating the executive and the councillors on what that role is, because, you know, how they influence, we know that they have to influence, but yeah, it's a bit of an uphill battle for me now to try and establish that finance panel, if that's the way we go. So yeah, so we had some very, we tried some things, we would do things a bit differently, but ongoing from here, we're really focusing on our asset management, which obviously is the next piece of work that councils will be looking at to deliberatively engage on their asset management. And we're heavily linking that to our service planning. So we're going to be combining that together to have another conversation with the community and potentially the panel. We're broadening our panel from 46 to, we're hoping, 400. And that's the next step, and we'll then feed that back into our 10-year financial plan. So as I said, it was a bit muddled, but we tried some different things, and I feel like, you know, we have landed in and got some, we're currently doing a report back to the panel on how they influenced the 10-year financial plan. So closing the loop, which is what our policy says. So might leave it there and just hand over to Nathan, who can talk about his experience at Bendigo.
Oh, thanks, Simone. I'll kick in and yeah, jump questions or any other bits or thoughts, even if you've got them, into the chat. Yep, Nathan, City of Greater Bendigo. Thanks to Kapia and Simone and Gab and everyone for pulling this together today. It's good to have a quick lunch and learn. Just wanted to say by saying well done to everybody for getting through to this point of the year. It's been a bit of a survival through COVID, and for those that have got homeschooling happening right now, us in the regions are thinking of you. I certainly went through it last week. And to have the 10-year financial plan, engagement, local government act and everything over the top of it, just make sure you're booking yourself in a break sometime in the next little while as well. Don't think we should let a PD go by without at least saying that along the road in making sure you're in the right space to be able to engage with the rest of it. Look, I did a little bit on the last PD day about the journey of the 10-year financial plan for the City of Greater Bendigo. So I'm not going to rehash that part, but that is actually on the Finpro website with myself and another Bendigo and Corangamite have got the PowerPoints from that. It's got a little bit of our process in there. So I'll pop that link in the chat again, just so you can go there later on if that's helpful as well. But we did a similar, I only touched on this a little bit in that preso, but we did a similar deliberative panel, 40 people. We had a youth panel as well, which was awesome. Best thing ever. Really kind of meant that some of the conversations had to come down and think a bit more about the future and climate change and other stuff. It was just really interesting to see how that played out. But again, for the finance bits, yes, we leaned on the council plan as well. And then we kind of tried to get in some finance bits after that. We didn't go as far as Simone and Frankston and have a separate finance one afterwards though. Just a couple of key points from me maybe though that I might focus more on what's coming up as well for us. So as has been mentioned by everybody, you've got a new engagement policy, so go and brush it off and have a look around just to make sure you kind of got it in frame for this year. We're just writing the plan for engagement for this year. So what does it mean for 22-23 budget? Now, do we have to deliberately engage? No, so it's not exactly the topic, but it's one community and there's going to be some engagement for the budget again. So how do we do it in line with those principles? So that's just something that's, if you like, present and current for us at the moment. And I'd just say it's worth having, we're trying to get to a point where we've got a plan for this. So we're wrapping up what we've learnt so far and still learning as we go through to our October adoption, if you like, of our 10-year financial plan and council plan. Make sure that's kind of captured somewhere so the learnings are there ready for the next time we all kind of go through it. And as I said, in responding to one of the questions, we think the value finance brings is to make sure that we are talking about priorities. We're not just talking about can we have more services in isolation parts. And that means that even into the next budget, we want to build that in a little bit like Frankston into the asset plan conversations. I thought some people might not have got to panels and done all of that sort of bit. And so a couple of the other engaging bits, if you like, to try and get more content out there that we've done is a one-pager that tries to summarise a couple of the key bits of the financials for the city, and then an easy read 3 to 4 page version of your financial plan. And it's just tries to strip out as much lingo, if you like. Of course, we've still got the heavy financial statements version that I'm sure at least 11 people in the community will read cover to cover. But there's the other version, if you like, that tries to get it a bit more pictorial and graphically, and happy to share some of that in the next week or so. If that's helpful as well, we'll try and stick that up on the website for those ones. So look, I might pull it up in a minute there, but just have a think about, I guess my main points are, it's worth getting down a plan for engagement for 21 over the next year for 22-23 leading into that, so you're clear in advance for the community whether you are going to have a similar 223 process later, or if it's something they need to get onto councillors about now. We're still going to have a send it out at the end of this year process, but to be true to engagement, we're going to let people know earlier so that they can send their project ideas in earlier. But we're not going to say, let's have a public submissions process at the end of this financial year, because we think the budget's just about done and we don't think that's kind of in line with our engagement policy. So if you like, we're trying to take some of the learnings we've got now and tweak it into how we engage a little bit annually going forward as well. And then having a plan for how you build this up for the 4-year engagement is the only other part that I think, while you've got it and you're close to it for the next couple of months, grab those learnings and bake them in ready for the next time we come up. And then you're ready to educate, might be a new council again, coming into the next round of planning. That's probably enough from me and the Bendigo's experience, just at a really quick level. Again, the democracy it's all quite doable. You don't always get it perfect, but having a go and trying it in your lingo is probably the main learning we had. When we actually got down to it and we had the panel sort of set up, it took effort, but it was very much worth it, and it was very, very quite doable actually. Just had to be planned and kind of actually take the time out for somebody to actually be resourced for it. Don't try and do all of this on top of everything else was probably our last key learning. Thanks, Simone. That's a quick little bit from Bendigo on maybe what's coming up soon. And I'll throw back to you guys.
Thanks, Nathan. We're really keen to see if anybody else wants to share their experience or got any questions. We don't seem to have anything else coming through the chat at the moment, but, you know, feel brave, put your hand up and maybe let us know something that you did that you thought was great, or, you know, any lessons learned or anything. All I can see is a sea of names.
One of the other things I'll share, Simone, just thinking about this, I used to be quite heavily involved with the consultation and research special interest group at LG Pro. So it's kind of like your engagement colleagues having a similar kind of conversation. I'd just kind of encourage maybe a bit of cross-pollination of the two groups, and maybe there's an opportunity to kind of, you know, not every local government has a community engagement advisor or even someone who has it in their PD to have it as a focus area. So there might be opportunity where those of you who are kind of struggling to find someone internally to have a chat with about, you know, engagement approaches, even just how do I scope, you know, in the really early days what the conversation might be, there might be a professional on that side of the fence who might, you know, be willing to have a bit of a chat with you. So not having to engage, you know, a consultant, there's so much knowledge in the sector. So I'd encourage you to kind of reach out to that group as well if that sounds kind of relevant.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. Thanks, Claire. I'll get those details maybe from you, and we can do something with that at the Finpro exec. We do have a question, or we've got a couple that have come through. Oh, now they're coming thick and fast. So we'll start with Amanda. So Amanda's keen to know if any other councils are going to attempt participatory, it's a hard word, participatory budgeting in the next years. I'll just go from Frankston. We've purchased a budget tool that we're going to be using. So Nathan,
yeah. Well, really briefly, yes, we've got a plan to. Do we have the plan resourced and sorted yet? No. But what we've wrestled with there is what I thought before I went through this process the last 6 months was that we'd stick it up on the website and everybody will have a go, and that's our participative democracy. And now what I've learned is that's not a representative sample, because I guarantee the people from the Golden Square pool community, they'll get 130 people doing exactly what needs to be done to fund their project. So that would not be a representative sample. So we're planning just in this financial year, hopefully, to test run that process with councillors, and then the year after, because there's just not the time now. Like, there's only 8 months left before we do a budget again. So we're thinking the year after we look at something a little bit longer term on the way into the budget, even after that might be a bit more in that space. That is broader in a bigger group that's representative kind of thing. So, because we feel like we've asked the community a lot the last 6 months, do we really want to go back out again like next month and ask again some more democracy stuff for the next budget? Yeah. That's just where we're at, though.
That's a really good point. We've been over consulting with our community too. I feel like we're out there every week asking. So we're trying to combine everything and be more strategic and get more out of the engagement. I've just quickly, we've got lots of questions now, which is great. So from Chen, we've got, how do you make sure that the recommendations from a small group of residents are well accepted by the wider community? I might throw to Claire or Neve on that one if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, happy to jump in, and Neve, if you wanted to add anything. It's a really good point, Jen, and it's one where we see some really successful models where there's been a little bit of a call and response with the broader community and then the deliberative process. So you sort of go out broadly with questions that, you know, don't require that time and dialogue, things like what matters to you, what's your lived experience in your local hood, and then being able to use that as a data source for your deliberative panel. That's a really great way to kind of bring that in. And then what the panel comes up with, if it's a draft vision or aspirations, that can be tested back with the broader community. So we do see that call and response a little bit. Where that doesn't happen and it's still successful is sharing the journey that the deliberative process goes on. So being able to share stories or you know, even documenting via video or that kind of thing, or even the panel members themselves or the participants themselves going out and being your advocate for the process and saying this was done really transparently, it was genuine, you know, I really believe in it, and you know, we're really proud of what we've we've come up with. So those sorts of things, we have seen those things work really well in terms of seeing the acceptance by the broader community.
Okay, great. Thanks, Claire. We'll keep going. There's some more questions, which is fantastic. So, Vaughan, what should our expectation be of this year's engagement plan that we have to do in the next couple of months? Deliberative engagement seems fanciful. So I think I'll just add one comment there from when I was on the co-design LGB group earlier last year, it must have been, when the changes to the Local Government Act were coming in. It was definitely a feeling of we start and then we show how we can go on from here. We get better. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect in, with all the other challenges that we've had this year. I think if you can document what you've attempted to do, what you're going to do, and have a real plan, I think that that will go a long way if you can show that you've really thought about it and you're on that path to get better at it. Nathan, I'm not sure if you have any.
Agree 100%. Do your best. But I might say that the best could include a summary version that's a little bit more engaging than a 60-page document that's stuck on a website for a 223 process. Just a challenge out there. If you want to try and get something a little bit more visual and engaging, it is doable with a couple of graphs and stuff at least. But if not, then you have a plan for what it looks like in the future. And at the front of your document, you say, here's where we're at. And next time we're going to try and do it like this, but at this point the councillors are doing this bit and we're seeking your comment now by the website for the next month or 3 weeks or whatever it is. So as long as you're sort of putting up the front what you're trying to do, I guess that's as much as you can do. If you haven't started a deliberative process and you're going to have it done by October, then no, don't try and squeeze a deliberative process in the next 3 weeks or something. Like it's not going to happen. It's a matter of just being realistic to yourself. And I come back to my comments about the big year, COVID, et cetera, et cetera. LGB gets all that. And we've had pretty direct conversations, certainly through Finpro exec and others. And they're pretty clear that we've all have a crack this time and do it as best we can in this iteration of, if you like, implementing the Act.
Absolutely. And that kind of leads into Chen's next question, which is she's keen to know whether councils are going to run the Section 223 process for the 22-23 budget. My understanding is that the Section 223 doesn't exist. However, there is an obligation to do not less than what was in the original Act, is how I kind of interpret it. So we still ran a process on ours, but I'm not sure if anyone up, Claire or Neve, if you have any further.
We're seeing public exhibition type engagement still occurring, because I think there's an acknowledgement that there's an expectation around that, or even a model where we're inviting submissions. So I think that it's probably becoming a tool in the toolkit rather than a prescribed process. Yeah.
I think that the loop back that you said earlier, Simone, the feedback at the end of a process is what that can do. What it's not for me is public submissions where people stand up and want the whole thing changed right at the end, because it's not realistic, and all it does is so it's just reduce that process is what I'd suggest. Yeah,
and it was very token, and it was the loudest voices often in the room. So the way we're doing it now is providing the quieter voices an opportunity to come through. The next question is about the name of the budgeting tool that Franklin is using. Is it part of another engagement platform you have? So I was just trying to wrap my brain what it was called, but we have purchased an engagement platform, and I think it's Hive. I'm going to say Hive. Yeah. Tell me what I have.
So there's two. So there's the Hive, or there's Engagement HQ, and both have that participatory budgeting capability. There's pros and cons for each. So I would check in with people who've used it before, but also talk to your engagement advisors just to check what you've already subscribed to as well.
Google Hume and Mitchell, because they've had a crack at some other ones that are slightly different platforms as well with sliders. So there's all sorts of options out there. It does take a bit of a look around for what you've got there.
And as Nathan said before, we're probably going to trial ours with the councillors first and then the community. So I'm happy to do maybe a session on how we navigate through Hive.
Simone, that was a suggestion as well, that I think to do something like with the community panel and then replicate with the broader community and see if there was a difference.
Yeah, well, it just helps facilitate the trade-off that we're talking about in an easier way. Some councils have offered remuneration for panels. Are there examples of how this has helped in ensuring reliable participation? I know ours received an honorarium for each session that they attended, and we did have very good attendance all through the vision and community panel work. We struggled with the reconvening them for the finance conversation, but we still had 15 out of the 46, which I think was good considering the time and the topic. And, you know, people often said, I thought it was going to be boring. But yeah, honorariums have, in my experience, anyone else want to add anything to that?
Say they're standard now, so there's something you should build into your budget for your engagement, and it's typically $50 for like the briefing session and then $100 for the full days. Claire, is that similar to
Yeah, definitely. And for us, you know, there was one particular council we worked with very diverse groups that were socially disadvantaged, and it really enabled them to be able to participate for sure.
And I'll just say as well, following on from that point, like for people who might be if you're doing the session in person, like covering people's cab charges isn't a really great way to support people. Making sure you ask what are some of the things that people need. Yeah, we did a platter box. Food. We gave people food. The next question is at HBCC, which I presume is Hobson's Bay maybe. We're trying to link our financial plan engagement to the engagement processes already conducted under the budget. Yep. Nathan, did you want to have a go at that one?
I certainly tried in the context of integrated strategic planning that they're all one conversation with the community. So I guess you can reference them, but if you weren't clear that the budget conversation was also about the 10-year financial plan, you just got to be cautious overusing or relying, but absolutely link them and make sure that people are realizing there are conversations that have happened. I guess the one other comment I make to that is that we certainly at the very start of it said we've had strategy conversations with the community for the last X years. And so here's some of the things we've already heard in the community. We're not starting from zero. And so really I think the main learning out of all of this is to say, how do you build it so that the next time you're not doing it from scratch? You kind of, here's where we're at to start with. We've got this and this and this in place. I think absolutely you can do that. Just be honest and clear about what that was and what people knew at that time compared to what you've got there now.
Yeah, fantastic. So another question from Vaughan. So the Community Vision Council plans and financial plans seem to be divorced from people's practical concerns. Is deliberative engagement likely to be more successful and meaningful during the service review conversations around specific services? Absolutely. I think services are the things that the community understand, and once you start talking about the levels of service or who's providing them or how they're funded and what's valued over another service in that trade-off, I think that gives you far more meaningful data to work with.
Absolutely. And people learn a lot about the role of council. So they may have a particular, oh my goodness, what about the youth on the streets and the drug problem, XYZ? Yep. And this is council's bit here, which is a part of that. And by the way, XYZ over here. And that's part of the conversation, Vaughan. And when we're actually at the panels, even, slightly cynical finance manager, I was kind of like, oh my God, people kind of drew some links and it made sense to them, but they realized we're not the hospital. And that's where just some people are at. And when you're in the pot of local government, you think it's kind of clear, but it really ain't. Of course, people think government is government. So there's always that element too that makes it real for people when you sort of dig underneath it a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, surprising for me too through the engagement process how many of our community members have no idea what services we provide. And that is an education process, and comms as well. We've got our comms involved in it, in trying to explain rates at work. All that helps with your capability, which is what Claire and Neve were talking about. What's the capability of the people that you're asking the questions of? And we have to help them understand and be more transparent. I think we just got one last, it's just a comment that Yarra Rangers has used Hive and they found it to be really helpful and supportive through the community panel process. We're looking forward to using it as well. And, you know, we can have conversations maybe around some of the tools, other tools that people are using, and